One of the most disorienting experiences for someone with an avoidant attachment style is the moment they realize they were wrong. Not just factually wrong, but emotionally, relationally wrong. And here's why that moment is so powerful. It cuts through the very defense system they've spent years, maybe decades building. Avoidants don't just avoid conflict, they avoid vulnerability, they avoid emotional exposure, and most of all, they avoid accountability when it threatens their sense of control or safety. So what happens when reality crashes into that internal structure? It's not dramatic at first, it's quiet, it's subtle. Sometimes it doesn't even look like a realization. It starts as discomfort. Something doesn't sit right. They replay a conversation they dismissed earlier, a text they left unanswered, a door they slammed metaphorically or literally. And for the first time, they don't just feel justified, they feel off. That's the crack in the wall. This isn't about guilt in the traditional sense. It's deeper. It's the philosophical tension between their desire to remain untouched and the undeniable truth that we are all inherently relational creatures. No one exists in a vacuum. And for the avoidant person, realizing they've hurt someone, not because they intended to, but because they refuse to engage, is destabilizing. It breaks the illusion of autonomy they've clung to for so long. Now, here's where psychology gets interesting. Avoidants often grow up in environments where their emotional needs weren't met. They learned, sometimes at a very young age, that needing others is dangerous, or at the very least, disappointing. So what did they do? They armored up, they became self-reliant, they mastered control. And they convinced themselves that if they just stayed out of emotional messiness, they'd be safe. But the cost of that safety is intimacy. The price is connection. So when they realize they're wrong, not just about an event, but about their entire coping strategy, it doesn't just challenge their ego. It threatens the foundation of how they've survived. This is why you'll often see resistance first. Denial, rationalizing. They'll intellectualize the situation, distance themselves from the emotional content. Not because they're manipulative, but because they've never been taught how to sit with discomfort. They've only been taught how to manage it. But here's the truth. Pain is a powerful teacher, and avoidance doesn't make it go away. It just delays the lesson. At some point, the consequences of emotional detachment show up. Maybe it's a partner walking away. Maybe it's a friendship that fades. Maybe it's that hollow feeling they can't shake, even when everything looks fine on the outside. That's the moment of friction. That's when something in them whispers, "You were wrong to shut down. You were wrong to walk away. You were wrong to pretend it didn't matter." And that whisper, it matters. Because in that moment, the avoidant person is experiencing something rare, self-confrontation, and it hurts. Not in a dramatic, crying on the floor kind of way. It hurts like cold clarity, like seeing yourself in a mirror for the first time without filters. And if they're brave enough to stay in that discomfort, something shifts. That's the doorway to growth, but it's narrow. And most people, avoidant or not, don't walk through it the first time. That's okay. What matters is that the realization happened, that the story they've been telling themselves, that distance equals strength, is finally being questioned. Now, if you're someone in a relationship with an avoidant, this is the part you'll likely never see, because they probably won't talk about it. They may never say, "Hey, I realized I was wrong to pull away," but you might feel it. A softer tone, a second attempt at a conversation they once avoided, a moment of presence when you least expect it. Don't ignore those shifts. They might be small, but they're seismic from the inside out. And if you are the avoidant, don't run from the discomfort. Lean into it. That ache in your chest, that's not weakness. That's awakening. That's the part of you that's still human, still wired for connection, still longing to belong, even if you don't know how to admit it yet. You're not broken. You're just unpracticed at being open. So when the avoidant realizes they're wrong, it's not just an oops moment, it's a reckoning, a rupture in the narrative of detachment. And if they're willing to stay in that moment long enough, it becomes the birthplace of something extraordinary, emotional responsibility. Because the truth is, real strength isn't found in distance. It's found in the courage to come closer, especially when it's hard. Let's talk about what happens immediately after the avoidant realizes they're wrong. Because here's the thing. Realization alone doesn't create change. In fact, the first reaction, more often than not, isn't repair. It's not a heartfelt apology. It's not even communication. It's retreat. Avoidants aren't wired to move toward discomfort. They move away from it. That's the core of their attachment pattern. So when they realize they're wrong, their nervous system doesn't say, go fix it. It says, run. And what that looks like, practically, is a whole mess of behaviors that confuse the people around them. They go silent. They shut down. They intellectualize the issue or act like it didn't happen. And sometimes they even double down on the behavior that caused the rupture in the first place. Why? Because shame just entered the picture. And shame for the avoidant is not a learning tool. It's a threat. Let's get under the hood for a second. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. That distinction is critical. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, shame hits hard because it confirms their worst internal fear, that closeness leads to rejection and mistakes mean disconnection. That's the emotional blueprint they've been living by. So rather than lean in and repair, their instincts say, protect, withdraw, distance yourself before they do it first. That's why you'll often see defensiveness first. Not because they don't care, but because they care and don't know how to express it without feeling exposed. Vulnerability for an avoidant isn't second nature. It's foreign. It's threatening. It requires a level of emotional fluency that they've spent their whole lives avoiding. And here's the kicker. The more significant the relationship is, the stronger the retreat response can be, because the stakes are higher. The potential for pain is greater. And that means the emotional armor gets heavier. So ironically, the more the avoidant cares, the more likely they are to pull away when they realize they've done damage. Now let's add another layer. The avoidant isn't just protecting themselves from the other person's reaction. They're protecting themselves from their own emotions. That's a form of internal avoidance we don't talk about enough. They might tell themselves things like, it's not a big deal, or they're overreacting, or I just need space to think. But all of that is code for, I don't know how to sit with this feeling and I need to get away from it before it consumes me. So what you end up seeing is emotional paralysis. They're in a freeze response, not quite flight, not quite fight, just stuck. And unfortunately, in relationships, that freeze looks like indifference. It looks like they don't care. And that misinterpretation can destroy trust faster than the initial mistake ever could. But let's flip this for a second, because there's a huge opportunity here if we can learn to read between the lines. When an avoidant withdraws after realizing they're wrong, they're not just being cold. They're overwhelmed. They're processing something that threatens their entire emotional framework. And if they're withdrawing, it means they haven't yet learned how to move through the discomfort without disconnecting from it. That's not a moral failing. It's a skill gap. And skill gaps can be closed with awareness, practice, and repetition. For those in relationship with an avoidant, whether it's romantic, familial, or even professional, understanding this freeze response is critical. It's not your job to fix it, but it is important not to personalize it. Their withdrawal isn't necessarily about you. It's about their internal conflict. And sometimes the best thing you can do is hold space without chasing, while also holding your boundaries with clarity and self-respect. For the avoidants listening, this is your edge. This is the uncomfortable place where growth happens. The moment you feel the urge to shut down, that's the exact moment to lean in. Just a little, not all the way, but enough to stay present, enough to ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? Because emotional maturity doesn't come from avoiding breakdowns. It comes from learning to stay with yourself when you're falling apart and choosing to show up anyway. The truth is, shame and withdrawal don't have to be the end of the story. They can be the beginning of a new pattern, one where you don't abandon yourself or the people you care about when things get hard. Because if realization is the crack in the armor, then what you do after that, how you handle the discomfort, that's what determines whether this moment becomes a cycle or a catalyst. Discomfort isn't the enemy, it's the invitation. The only question is, will you answer it? Once the initial wave of discomfort passes, after the realization, the shame, the withdrawal, something more complex starts to unfold. And this part right here is where the avoidant starts to wrestle with a deeper tension. It's not just emotional, it's existential. It's the inner tug of war between pride and connection. Pathetic, and it's brutal. You have to understand, pride isn't just about ego for someone with an avoidant attachment style. It's not arrogance. It's not superiority. Pride for them is protection. It's the armor they've crafted to survive a world that once felt emotionally unsafe. It tells them, you don't need anyone. You're fine on your own. Don't show weakness. Don't let them in. That narrative becomes a kind of internal compass. So when they find themselves in a moment where they want to reach out, want to reconnect, want to admit they were wrong, it doesn't feel like courage. It feels like betrayal. A betrayal of the very strategy that kept them emotionally intact for years. Now, this doesn't mean they don't care. On the contrary, if they're in this space, caught between wanting to make things right and wanting to hold on to their pride, it's because they do care. The issue isn't the absence of emotion. It's the inability to express it without feeling exposed. So what you'll often see in this stage is hesitancy, inaction, days of overthinking, internal debates that no one else can hear. And from the outside, it might look like nothing is happening. But inside, there's chaos, a back and forth battle between two core needs, the need to feel emotionally safe and the need to restore connection. And let me tell you, this battle runs deep. Psychologically, the avoidant has built their identity around independence. They don't just prefer it, they rely on it to define who they are. So the idea of stepping forward, saying something as simple as, I was wrong, feels like a complete deconstruction of self. Like their internal system is being rewritten in real time. That's why they often stall at this point. Not because they don't want repair, but because they're still trying to figure out how to do it without losing their sense of self. The truth is, they're not resisting accountability. They're afraid that accountability will cost them dignity. That if they admit fault, they'll be seen as weak. And that perception of weakness, it's intolerable for someone who spent their life trying to be emotionally invulnerable. But here's the philosophical truth. Vulnerability isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing that human beings are flawed, messy, contradictory, and still showing up anyway. It's the capacity to say, I don't have it all figured out. I got this wrong, and I care enough to make it right. That's strength. That's character. That's how you build trust, not just with others, but with yourself. Because make no mistake, this inner conflict isn't just about the other person. It's about self-trust, about whether the avoidant can trust themselves to step outside the protective shell without shattering, whether they can survive being seen, whether they can be soft without being destroyed. That's why when they finally begin to lean toward connection, it's rarely dramatic. It's not some sweeping apology. It's quiet. It's a text that simply says, hey. It's showing up somewhere they weren't expected. It's a subtle shift in energy, in tone, in presence. Because for the avoidant, even these small actions take enormous internal effort. They represent the triumph of growth over fear. And if you're the one on the receiving end of this, pay attention. Don't dismiss the small gestures. That shift you just felt, that's the avoidant letting their guard down. That's them choosing relationship over reflex, choosing intimacy over instinct. That's progress. And if you are the avoidant, hear me clearly. This inner tug of war you feel, it's not a sign of weakness. It's the evidence that something inside you is waking up, that the part of you that craves real connection is starting to challenge the part of you that only knows how to survive. That's not something to fear, it's something to honor. You are not betraying yourself by choosing connection. You're expanding yourself. You're stepping into a new version of who you can be, one that isn't ruled by outdated defenses or old survival stories. You're not abandoning your independence. You're integrating it with your humanity. Because in the end, pride can protect you, but it can't fulfill you. Connection can. The question is, when the moment comes, which one will you choose? By the time an avoidant reaches the point where they're considering how to make things right, what comes next often surprises people. It's not a grand apology. It's not an emotional outpouring or some soul-bearing moment. Instead, it's subtle, quiet. It looks like small shifts, behavioral changes, actions that, if you're not paying attention, you might miss. But make no mistake, for the avoidant, those subtle moves are monumental. See, when avoidant individuals begin to take accountability, they don't usually use language the way someone with a secure or even anxious attachment style might. Words like, "I'm sorry," or "I hurt you" can feel way too vulnerable, too exposing. Their nervous system isn't built to lead with emotion. It's trained to minimize it, contain it, stay in control. So rather than say, "I know I was wrong," they might show up differently. They might reach out when they normally wouldn't, or remember something small and bring it up as a way to reestablish a thread of connection. This is where a lot of people get it wrong. They expect the apology to come dressed a certain way. It should be open, verbal, emotionally expressive. But avoidants don't heal or connect through emotional expression first. They do it through action, through consistency, through the kind of change that says, "I may not know how to say this yet, but I'm trying to show you." Psychologically, this makes sense. When you've spent your life protecting yourself from vulnerability, words feel dangerous. They're too direct. They leave too much room for interpretation, rejection, or shame. But behavior feels safer. It's a more controlled way to test the waters of reconnection. So if you're the one in relationship with an avoidant, this is the moment to tune in. Look past what's not being said. Pay attention to the small signs. These micro-agments are often their way of signaling, "I care. I'm not running anymore. I just don't know how to say it yet." And for the avoidant, if you're in that place where you know you were wrong and you're trying to come back, understand this: your actions do matter. Even if you can't find the right words yet, even if the other person isn't sure how to receive you, the effort counts, but only if it's consistent. One kind gesture followed by another disappearance won't build anything. This is where the rubber meets the road. You don't have to perform some emotional transformation overnight. You just have to show up differently and keep showing up. Now, here's the deeper truth. The way you repair doesn't have to look like anyone else's, but it does have to be honest, and it has to be clear. There's a huge difference between avoidance and intentionality. Avoidance is silence with fear behind it. Intentionality is quiet effort with purpose. One leads to confusion and resentment. The other leads to trust. There's also a philosophical element at play here. At some point, every human being has to confront the question, am I willing to be uncomfortable in order to grow? And for the avoidant, this discomfort lives in the territory of repair, because making things right requires humility. It requires doing things before you're ready. It requires leaning into connection before you feel completely safe. And that's hard. It goes against the grain of everything your coping mechanisms have taught you. But this is the paradox of healing. Growth rarely feels good at first. Progress often looks like awkwardness, not clarity, especially for avoidance, especially when repair is involved. So the discomfort you feel, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing something new. And look, the person you hurt may not respond the way you want them to. That's part of the risk. That's part of the emotional maturity you're stepping into. The understanding that repair is about responsibility, not control. You can't dictate how someone receives your effort, but you can choose to keep showing up with integrity. That shift, when you move from avoidance to presence, from silence to subtle effort, it might not be loud. It might not even be recognized at first, but it matters because it's not just about them, it's about you, reclaiming your ability to participate in connection, to break the pattern, to stop letting fear write the story. So whether you're on the giving or receiving end of that subtle effort, pay attention. Those small moments, they're not small. They're the beginning of something new. A relationship that's not built on avoidance, but on the courage to care, even when it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes the most powerful apology isn't what you say, it's what you consistently choose to become. There comes a moment after the realization, the retreat, the wrestle with pride, the subtle steps toward repair, where something else quietly begins to emerge, and that something is identity. The avoidance starts to ask not just what happened in the relationship or what do I need to fix, but who am I now that I see myself differently? This is a profound shift. Up until now, everything has been reactive, navigating discomfort, shame, inner conflict. But now the avoidant is facing something far more unsettling. The recognition that their old patterns, the ones they used to call just who I am, don't serve them anymore. The mask no longer fits. And when the mask doesn't fit, identity begins to crack open. See, avoidant attachment isn't just about behaviors, it's about belief systems. It's a core part of how someone sees the world, how they've made sense of love, safety, and self-worth. So when an avoidant begins to grow, they're not just shifting how they respond to others. They're actively dismantling the narrative that they've been living by for years, sometimes decades. A narrative that says, you're safer alone. Connection is dangerous. Don't rely on anyone. Don't let anyone rely on you. When you start seeing the cracks in that story, you can't unsee them. And that's where it gets existential. Because now the avoidant doesn't just feel wrong about a moment. They feel unanchored, untethered. If I'm not the guarded one, the self-contained one, the lone wolf, then who am I? What does connection even look like for someone like me? And let's be real, that question isn't just psychological, it's philosophical. It digs into the very nature of identity itself. Are we our patterns? Are we our defenses? Or are we something deeper? Something that can evolve once we get honest about what those patterns have cost us. This stage is disorienting. And if you're going through it, don't expect clarity right away. There's often grief here because growth involves loss. The loss of the coping mechanisms that kept you safe, the loss of the roles you used to play, the loss of being able to say, this is just who I am, and hide behind it. But here's what no one tells you, that grief is a sign you're moving into something more real, more whole. You're not losing yourself. You're releasing the version of you that was built around fear. That's why when an avoidant finally moves through all the earlier stages, awareness, discomfort, action, the real transformation isn't just in how they relate to others. It's in how they relate to themselves. For the first time, they begin to experience themselves as someone who can be both autonomous and emotionally present, strong and open, independent and connected. And that duality, that's maturity. That's integration. That's when the avoidant stops operating from either or and starts living in both and. It doesn't mean they become perfect communicators overnight, or that they suddenly crave emotional closeness 24/7. No, what changes is the resistance. The walls don't go up as quickly. The fear doesn't hijack the steering wheel. There's more space, more choice, more capacity to sit in vulnerability without collapsing or running. And what that does more than anything is create room for authentic relationships. Not performative ones, not transactional ones. Real, mutual, human connection. The kind that isn't built on control or distance, but on presence. On being willing to be seen and to see others in return. Now let's talk about what this means for the people in relationship with avoidance. Whether it's romantic, platonic, or professional, when an avoidant begins to change, it can be confusing. They may show up differently. They may ask for what they need. They may offer closeness in small but meaningful ways. And if you've been hurt by their distance before, you might not trust that change at first. That's okay. You're allowed to protect yourself, but also be willing to see the shift. Growth is rarely loud. Sometimes it looks like a pause instead of a shutdown. A "how are you" text that wasn't required. A conversation they once would have avoided. And your willingness to meet those moments with openness, without over-idolizing or under-recognizing them, can make all the difference. Because here's the deeper truth. We all wear armor. Some people build theirs out of people-pleasing, others out of perfectionism. For avoidance, it's distance. But once they realize that armor doesn't protect them, it isolates them, something changes. And when it does, they don't just show up differently in relationships, they show up differently in life. That's the shift we're after. Not just behavior change, but identity evolution. The understanding that you are not your past, you are not your defense mechanisms, you are not your fear, you are the awareness underneath it all. And you get to choose what comes next. Change isn't just about doing different, it's about becoming different. And that choice, that's always yours.